Um, this year's topic is big data and artificial intelligence, the promise and the peril. Big data, artificial intelligence, those are some imposing words, right, for some technologies that are increasingly powerful and increasingly pervasive in modern life, right? Um, we also talk about machine learning, right, and uh, a variety of other terms in this topic, in this general sort of area, but it refers to technologies that we're seeing more and more of, right, in every part of life, from work to driving to fitness and eating to all sorts of data analysis in every area, prison sentencing, all sorts of things, right? Um, we've heard a lot, we've been hearing for years about the promise of these technologies, right? What wonderful things they're gonna create. And more recently, we've been hearing about and thinking about the perils of these technologies. And in this lecture series, we're going to have experts who help us think through and sort through the serious and the sensational, help us to reimagine what our future is going to be like in the face of these advances and these changes, and help us think about the world that we want to make. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Professor Cary Fiesler, who's a founding faculty member of the Department of Information Sciences at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She has her PhD in human-centered computing from the great Georgia Institute of Technology, as well as a JD in law. Sorry, that's obvious. A JD from Vanderbilt Law, right? And her research is in both the ethics and the legal side of social computing in online communities and in technology ethics education. And her lecture tonight is Data is People, Ethical Considerations in Data Collection and Use. Please welcome Dr. Fiesler.
Thank you. Um, it's quite an honor to be one of the first people to tell you about the perils of big data today. Hopefully, I kicked this off well. Um, as Dr. Brown said, um, a lot of my research is in the area of things like governing the internet and in terms of service, privacy policy, different things about technology ethics, and in particular research ethics, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about today. Um, Starting with some ethical controversies that you probably have heard about and that change every time I give a talk, kind of like this. I'm going to tell you about some of the work that I've done around data scraping in terms of service and the ethics of Twitter research, and then telling you the two hills that I will die on, one that has to do with research ethics and one that has to do with ethics education. So I was doing this work before Cambridge Analytica. However, that was a fun coincidence, and I got to talk to a lot of journalists when this happened because it's an interesting example of the unexpected things that one can do with your data. Um, and this was not the first time that we've had this kind of ethical controversy where perhaps an algorithm knows something about us that we didn't want it to know, didn't want anyone else to know, or just that our data has been collected or used in ways we don't expect. Um, Another one was when a researcher in Europe scraped all of OkCupid, did some interesting data analyses, and then released the entire data set publicly. Another was when some researchers created a machine learning algorithm that could predict someone's sexuality from a photograph. Um, if you don't know exactly how machine learning works, a sort of simple example comes from the television show Silicon Valley, if you're familiar with this. Someone created an app that could tell whether something was a hot dog or not a hot dog. um, and the sort of science behind this, in a very simplistic sense, is that if you show a machine a lot of pictures of a hot dog and tell it it's a hot dog, then it can tell you whether something is a hot dog or not. And so the way that these algorithms work is that they need data. A giant data monster the more you have, the more accurate it can be. And one of the things that I imagine you'll hear more about as this lecture series progresses is that the kind of data you feed it is going to change the outcome. Garbage in, garbage out. It's one way of thinking about it. And so, for example, if I wanted to create an algorithm that could recognize a professor from a photograph, where might I find a lot of photographs of professors? Well, this algorithm might not think I'm a professor. um, so one thing that we've been thinking a lot about when it comes to the ethics of creating algorithms like this is whether they're biased in certain ways. And in this case, I might just go to Google image search to get this data, but there is another really good, or at least very big, source of data for all kinds of things, which is social media. This is based on one page of Google Scholar results for things we can predict with social media. Um, Age, depression, flu trends, personality traits, even elections. And of course, in order to do research like this, we just need more and more data, which is why social media is so great. It's just there. It's there and it's public, and most importantly, it's super easy to get a lot of the time. In fact, if you were wondering why Twitter was more popular in that list of headlines than, say, Facebook, which is actually a larger social media source of data, it's because Twitter is public and there's an API. And I did this in 5 seconds using a Google spreadsheet. Zeynep Tufekci has talked about Twitter as having the model organism problem. The same as a fruit fly. In biology, we study it because it's easy to study. And it's really easy to get that data. And again, it's public, so we're not thinking a lot necessarily about the other implications. So for this example, the algorithm that can detect someone's sexuality, where do we think we get that data from? So again, we had the example of the Google Scholar images of the professor. So the problem there is there's bad data. There's a way to get really good data for this one. Where might we find a labeled data set that just has photographs and people's sexuality attached to it? And remember, we saw OkCupid earlier. There's some public data, according to researchers. Interesting. You might wonder, for example, if the purpose of this algorithm, according to the paper that they wrote at least, was basically because there are so many terrible things that you could do with it that it's really important we tell people that we definitely can do it so we can protect ourselves against, for example, governments where it's illegal to be gay. I'm not sure how I would feel if I knew that my profile picture was used to build an algorithm like that. And that's just one of many questions about data collection that don't really have a lot of answers right now. I've been running research ethics workshops at conferences for social computing researchers for years. And every time we finish, we have the same set of open questions that I had at the last ethics workshop that I ran. Things around, and this first one's really important, what even is public data? Think about things like consent, about violations of terms of service, expectations. Can we use deleted data or leaked data? How do we anonymize it? We don't really have good answers for these. And one of the reasons is because the way that we have traditionally thought about research ethics is this: human subjects research. This is what university IRBs care about. for example, about gaining data through intervention or interaction or collecting identifiable private information. So the problem is that tweets don't really fall under this definition. Um, as a result, we just don't have rules for what to do about this kind of data. Jessica Vitak, a collaborator of mine, has done a couple of studies. One was surveying internet researchers about their practices and norms and how they feel about data collection of public data. And then she also surveyed IRBs to see how they feel about it. And this is the answer to both of them. Nobody knows. Highly inconsistent, basically no rules and not even very clear norms about these kinds of things. And so researchers are making these decisions not necessarily based on any sort of external forces. And if I ask internet researchers, which could be anything from the computer scientists that are creating these machine learning algorithms to social scientists who just want data about human behavior, I usually get two answers. I decide if I can collect data first by asking if the terms of service prohibit it, and then by asking if the data is public. So these are the two most important things. And terms of service is something I'm particularly interested in. I've done some work on that previously. And in fact, this became important to me because when I was in graduate school, I also went to graduate school at Georgia Tech, which is where the app Yik Yak was founded. Does anyone remember Yik Yak? Rest in peace, Yik Yak. A friend of mine was their first and last PhD researcher. My research lab was interested in studying Yik Yak, and I unfortunately am the buzzkill lawyer that read the terms of service. And I was like, we're not allowed to collect data from this app. It's against the rules. And then we didn't, because I have no plausible deniability. And then other researchers collect data and write awesome papers about Yik Yak. I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem fair. This is actually a big point of disagreement in my research community right now about whether it's okay to violate terms of service. And I'm interested in this from a sort of ethical perspective as well. And so I thought, well, I want to at least get an understanding of what they are before I tell people whether or not I think they should be able to violate them. So with some collaborators, we collected the terms of service from over 100 different social media sites and looked for the data scraping provisions. These are some examples. They all look pretty similar. Like this middle one, I mean, in fact, some of them were just copied and pasted. Sometimes you find sites like Twitter and Facebook, and then I think a lot of other sites sort of bootstrap by just copying them. FetLife is actually the only platform we found that specifically said academic researchers do not do research here, which is interesting. Mostly we just get, don't scrape. If you look at these, I mean, you can't really see anything from this except for just the check marks about what kind of data scraping provisions they have, which just kind of look random. We also did an analysis of similarity in language across sites. And we're like, oh, maybe we're going to see some similarities, like sites like this have this kind of provision in site. And no, it's random. The best actually possible explanation we could think of in terms of things that looked similar, because the sites had no reasonable similarity to each other, was that maybe they're hiring the same law firm to write their terms of service. I mean, it's hard to say. But the important thing here is that most of these just say, don't scrape. Basically, they don't care about context. It doesn't matter what kind of data you're collecting. It doesn't matter what you're going to do with it. It doesn't matter who you are or what the expectations and norms of the platform are. So the issue is that if you're making a decision about whether you can collect data based on terms of service, it assumes that A, violating a terms of service is always unethical, which is perhaps not always the case because, for example, a platform could put a provision in their terms of service that says you can only collect data if the paper that you write is positive towards the company. And then you might say it's an ethical imperative to violate it. But I think the more problematic thing is that the assumption here that violating terms of service is the only thing that can make data collection unethical, which then means that all these things I just pointed to don't matter at all, which is the next thing I want to talk about. So it relates to this, which is that you decide if it's okay to collect data about is it public. I cannot tell you how many papers I've read that justify data collection with it was public. That's all that matters. So here again is a type of data that could be considered public. Same with another dating platform, OkCupid. And again, this is a data set that was released publicly. No anonymization, just a huge database of all of the information on OkCupid, which if any of you have ever used OkCupid, you might know that there are the answers to, let's just say, some very, very personal questions, then tied to things like zip code, age, and lots of other stuff. And so some people got on Twitter and were like, it seems like maybe this data set's kind of identifiable. Like, you even have usernames in here. And the response was, the data is public. This is the same response that was used in the mid-2000s when someone scraped Facebook profiles in a way that was highly identifiable. And in this case, really problematic because it had information about, for example, sexual preferences, which then could be tied to real names fairly easily. But who knows how OkCupid users or other kinds of social media users might actually feel about this kind of thing. I mean, the interesting thing is that we've been having these arguments in my research community for years about this use of public data, and no one ever thinks about what it actually means for, say, Twitter users. And I was really interested in this question. It's a really simple research question. How do Twitter users feel? So Twitter is a great example because, again, it's kind of the fruit fly of social media research. If you go on Google Scholar and put in Twitter data, you will find a treasure trove. Your tweets could very possibly be in some scientific paper about something. So we wanted to find out how Twitter users feel about it. And, I will say it's a very tricky problem to study how people feel about research, because people who hate research probably don't want to participate in my research study about how they feel about research. Some selection bias there. So actually, when we went into this study, we thought, well, if it comes back and the data is like, yeah, research is awesome, then we'll just throw it away. We wasted money paying participants. But that's not what we found. So I actually suspect that attitudes might, on average, be even worse than what's reflected here. But to me, the most interesting thing is, one, that most people had no idea that this is a thing that happens. And I can anecdotally tell you this is true. Because people ask me all the time, like, what's your research about? And I'm like, well, one thing I'm interested in is like the use of public data in research. And what? I mean, the answer, the reaction is really like, why would scientists care about my tweets? And there are lots of things about your tweets that are interesting. For example, the chair of my department at CU studies crisis informatics. People tweeting about hurricanes, for example, is very interesting. Crisis coordination, how information spreads. Speaking of AI, so most people have no idea this is a thing that can happen. There's also research that shows that people don't really have a good sense in general of how information flows on social media. So, for example, everything from, can researchers use your tweets, the fact that journalists republish tweets to the fact that certain third parties have access to your data. And of course, we were like, well, now that we've told you that, first we asked you if you knew this was a thing, and then we told you it was. And then almost half told us that they thought, well, this is clearly against the rules. um, Mostly because it must be violating some ethical rules for researchers. Though it's also interesting that almost a quarter of the people thought it has to be a violation of Twitter's terms of service. Twitter's privacy policy actually says, hey, by the way, people like universities might be using your tweets, just so you know. And actually, I was talking to an engineer at Twitter who was in part of their machine learning team, and I said, you know, how do you feel about the fact that like most Twitter users, you know, don't expect their tweets to be used in this way? And he was like, it's in our terms of service, so clearly they don't mind. I don't know how many of you read terms of service. We also asked them whether they thought they should be able to use tweets without permission, and most people said no. What I found really interesting about this is that most people told us that they actually, they wish, it's not necessarily that they wanted to give permission, it's that they wanted to know. In fact, they were like, I want to read if my tweet is part of a study, I want to read a paper about it. I want to know how my tweet contributed to science, which always surprises people when I tell them this because, I mean, scientists usually don't share their data back with the community that they study, but the idea of doing it with a bunch of Twitter users seems a little crazy. But I was not actually interested in sort of a something like, should we use tweets in research? Like, I'm definitely not going to say no to that answer because there's a lot of really important research that's happening that couldn't otherwise. What I'm interested in instead is what kinds of things should we take into account when people are collecting this data? What are the contextual factors that should matter? If we're going to do it, which we are, because if I went around telling people that we need to stop using tweets in research, I would be very, very unpopular. If we're going to do it, how can we do it ethically? So I was actually more interested in contextual things like the kind of data collection. Like, does it matter to you if it's a million tweets versus a dozen tweets? Things about, for example, deleted tweets, how it's analyzed by a computer, by a human, whether it's profile information, etc. This chart shows the differences in opinion for these things. I mean, so for example, one thing that did not surprise me at all is that people would be really upset, that dark blue, 54% there, if it's tweets from a protected account, which means that maybe they shouldn't be considered public. But also, for example, people were more comfortable with machines analyzing tweets than humans analyzing tweets, more comfortable the bigger the data set was, and didn't want their Twitter handles included. Like, they didn't want attribution. Other things that mattered were things like what the study was for, whether their name was associated with, how the data was disseminated, and of course, it seems kind of obvious what the tweet was about. So all of these same things, context that matters. What kind of data it is, what you're going to do with it, who you are, what the expectations of the users are, which is my first hill to die on, which is that publicness isn't the only thing that matters. And now let me try to make that argument a little stronger. So this is from a paper that was about how people's language changes on Twitter after they get engaged. Not super racy subject matter, pretty innocuous, tweets about fishing and that kind of thing. So this is a table that shows examples of different categories, a code book, which is pretty common. Also for papers that might describe how machine learning algorithms work, because when you create training data, you have to label it. So collect a million tweets, decide qualitatively what the categories are, then feed them into the machine. So a code book like this is pretty common. So there was actually a New York Times article that talked about this paper. It was for Valentine's Day. They were doing a story on romantic computer science research. And the journalist put those tweets into the search bar of Twitter and found them, and then contacted the users and said, hey, your tweet was in a research paper. Let's talk about it. Nothing bad happened here. I mean, probably what happened was my tweet was in a research paper. That's really weird. But it's a tweet about going fishing, so who cares, right? No big deal. There was recently some research from that showed that 72% of articles in PubMed, which is all health-related, medical-related articles, quoted at least one tweet, and of those, it would lead back to the Twitter user 84% of the time. And this was just medical-related articles, which is, a little bit different. So the thing that drives me crazy about this publicness thing, that the only thing that matters is whether a tweet is public, is that it suggests that this tweet about what someone had for breakfast should be treated exactly the same as this tweet about suicide, or this tweet revealing someone's HIV status. The issue with this is that, again, there's research that shows that people don't necessarily have particularly good mental models of how their information flows on social media. So when you tweet something like this, you might know intellectually that it's public. You might know, but you still expect that the audience for this is your 200 Twitter followers, not, for example, like the entire audience of BuzzFeed. I will say that as much as I sort of talk about how researchers need to be very careful about this, the potential for amplification actually tends to come from the possibility that it can get filtered through the media. Because as we know, not that many people read academic articles. But a lot of people read BuzzFeed. And people don't realize how easy it is to find information there. You can go into Twitter search bar and type in Titanic was real, which is probably what BuzzFeed did for this article about people who didn't know the Titanic was real. You probably see this all the time, right? This is an extreme example. I started doing some data collection around what happens after this happens. And a lot of the time, the tweet is gone, or even the entire user account is gone. I mean, this is a pretty, again, people might get sort of made fun of for this, but if you think of something like the case of Justine Sacco, who is featured in John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. Justine tweeted something pretty racist, to be fair. But she had, 500 Twitter followers. And then she got on a plane, and then 8 hours later, she got off a plane, and she had no job, and the entire world hated her because this tweet had gone far larger than she expected. One could argue about the sort of ethical rules that journalists should have around this kind of thing, though arguably researchers are supposed to be thinking about the potential harms to their participants in ways that journalists may not have to. The problem is that often computer scientists in particular aren't thinking of Twitter users as participants. It's just data. And we should also be thinking about not just what the content is, but who the content belongs to. So this is a table created by one of my PhD students based on a study that she did recently where she was interviewing members of online fandom. So communities of people who write fan fiction, for example. Um, and this breakdown of demographics is pretty typical. Um, fandom tends to be mostly women with a large LGBTQ component. Um, and she was talking to her participants about what happens when their social media data goes outside of this community. So, for example, one person mentioned, what if something like, what if my content gets to something like BuzzFeed without my permission, and told the story of a Tumblr user that was mentioned in an article without his permission, citing some posts he made. His identity was then revealed to a much broader audience than Tumblr or in fandom. There was also a similar story from someone whose art was shared on BuzzFeed, and they became very concerned that someone might recognize the style of their art, and then it would go back to their Tumblr, and then it would connect their Tumblr to their real identity. The reason that this is a big deal is because there are a lot of people who are in the LGBT community. And one of the things about these particular online communities is that it's a place where they can be themselves, and they might not be able to be in real life. In this case, they were saying they could be thrown out of their houses or killed. I know that being outed for what you are and who you act in particular fandoms has caused problems. And so the issue here is that even something like posting a piece of art outside of the community, somewhere with a bigger audience, BuzzFeed, could lead to that person to be outed, which is a much bigger consequence than the New York Times article that shared someone's tweet about phishing. They talked about one of the problems here being that people came into the community, they parachute in, they don't really look around, they just take stuff, and then they leave. One of the things that we thought about because of this research was maybe people should have to understand the community before they just take data from it. So this is the other thing. If we're not thinking about data as people, then we're not necessarily thinking about the consequences to these people, right? So again, this community is different than people on Twitter talking about what they had for breakfast. The consequences of this are more severe. Imagine if that tweet in the New York Times had been a tweet from someone in this community instead, even if it was about something innocuous. It could tie back to their real identity, which could then have consequences. And you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you took the time to understand the community that you were taking data from. It also matters in this sense what you do with that data. So this is something that I think a lot about as well. If all we care about is the publicness of data, that suggests not only that it doesn't matter what the data is about or who the data is from, but also what you're going to do with it, which then suggests that there's nothing unethical that you can possibly do with public data. But if I were part of the LGBT community, I might care a lot if my data were used to create an algorithm that could actively do harm to my community. In this similar example, someone was creating a facial recognition technology that could more accurately determine gender, including accounting for people who are transgender. And so the data set they used were transition videos from YouTube. People who were sharing their stories about their gender transition in order to help other people in their community. Their data was harvested to use to create an algorithm to better detect gender using facial recognition technology. A PhD student in my program recently did some research with people in the transgender community about how they feel about facial recognition technology. And to them, the mere existence of this technology they find harmful, because just creating an algorithm that says you're male and you're female reduces gender to a binary in a way that is harmful to a concept that is not actually binary. Something else that is a use of technology that people might not have been particularly fond of, the fact that a lot of people's data was used to create models that were then used to potentially manipulate people during the last presidential election. I talked to a lot of people about this particular case, and a lot of the discussion around it was, oh my gosh, the privacy violation here of some people's data being harvested without their permission, the use of the data, oh my gosh, it was used in such a terrible way. I don't think that what a lot of people realized is that this was also a research ethics scandal. So the way that Cambridge Analytica worked was that a number of years ago, um, there was a paper published that showed the significant correlation between Facebook likes and personality traits via standardized personality quizzes, whether you're an INTP or whatever. So this paper was published in 2013, and the basic point of it was, isn't it interesting how well you can predict someone's personality traits from their Facebook likes? And it wasn't things that you would expect, right? It wasn't like, oh, you like, really loud music, and so therefore you're an extrovert. It was much more nuanced than that. And in that paper, it actually looked a lot like the end of the sexual orientation algorithm paper, where they said, gosh, you could do some really bad things with this technology. And guess what? Someone did some bad things with it. What was interesting about this is that it's not, this is different than targeted advertising. The way that targeted advertising might work is like, oh, I post on Facebook about having a dog and it shows me an ad for dog food. This was like, you posted on Facebook about having a dog, and because you happen to like this band and this TV show and you went to this place, we know you're an extrovert. So therefore we're going to advertise dog food to you using an ad that has like a video of a bunch of people meeting in a dog park. Or we know that you're an introvert, so we're going to advertise dog food to you using a picture of you alone on the couch with a dog. That's what was happening with the kind of manipulation that was possible here. And the way that the bad actors here got this data was they said they were scientists. Hey, we're collecting data for science. Can you fill out this personality quiz? And then instead of using it for science, they use it to build these models that could be used essentially to manipulate people. It matters what you do with data, right? if people had known this was how their data was going to be used, they probably wouldn't have consented. They probably wouldn't have put in that personality test. There's also a lot of research, particularly recently, towards using social media data to infer things about people that they might not have otherwise disclosed. So I showed you a tweet earlier, for example, that suggested someone might be suicidal. You can see the real benefit of this kind of research. Can we intervene, for example? Can we tell early that someone might be suicidal and then help them? So you can also see ways that this could be used by others, right? Um, for example, if you can tell from someone's tweets or their Instagram posts if someone has an eating disorder, maybe you could advertise diet pills to them. Or one of the more likely uses of this kind of data, insurance companies. In fact, right now there is talk of regulation in New York State about what kind of social media insurance companies can use, because it's already happening. For example, my watch, which sometimes speaks unexpectedly, can tell you my activity level for a long time. And a lot of people connect their fitness trackers to Twitter. And it tweets, you know, how much you move every day. Or sometimes fitness trackers have their own public sites that aren't necessarily intended for the public at large, but for that community of people trying to lose weight, for example. And maybe my insurance company thinks I don't move enough and they're going to make my premiums higher. Or maybe I've never even tweeted about, say, having an eating disorder, but now my insurance company knows and maybe they want to make my premiums higher. Another thing to think about for this one, beyond just use, is back to the amplification problem. So here it's not even just, here's a tweet about someone going fishing, and we categorize it as someone going fishing. But instead, we have created an algorithm that can determine levels of depression. Here is a tweet that is someone who is very depressed. Here is a tweet from someone who is kind of depressed. And then imagine that one ends up in a news article. Now, I'm not saying that anyone is doing this. I mean, I hope not. I haven't yet come across someone quoting a tweet in a paper in which the subject matter is very, very disturbing, or where it's an inference that might be problematic. But the thing is that if our only ethical heuristic is the data public, which is pretty common right now, as I said, then there's nothing to prevent that kind of thing. Now, you're probably thinking, well, this makes sense to me because it's different when, like, it matters what the tweet's about, it matters what you do with it, it matters who you are. Are you an insurance company or are you a scientist? Is it a tweet about what you had for breakfast or a health condition? Are you going to find a cure for cancer with this, or are you going to detect people's sexuality, right? These are all things that seem kind of obvious, but not something that's actually working in the sort of ethical rules for the field right now. The other thing that comes up with respect to this is, well, I just created an algorithm so that I can help people. If I can determine whether someone's suicidal, maybe I can intervene. It's not my fault if someone else uses this in an unethical way. This is something that I hear a lot lately. This also comes up, for example, with respect to predictive policing. There was recently a computer scientist gave a talk about an algorithm that could identify gang crimes. So, imagine how those work. Feed it in. Here are a bunch of examples of gang crimes. Here are a bunch of examples that are not gang crimes. You can imagine how that kind of data could potentially be biased. And so while he gave this talk, someone said, so could that data maybe be biased? Are you worried that if this data is used in actual law enforcement situations, that something bad could happen? And the response was, I'm just an engineer. That's not my job. That's for someone else to do. This is a conversation that I have a lot. This is not the only time this has happened. I hear variations of I'm just an engineer or I just built the thing a lot. And that gets you off the hook because it's someone else's job. It's the philosopher's job to think about these things, not the person who's actually building the technology. And to be honest, I'm not super surprised that this is an outcome because often this is how we teach ethics to technologists. I've been at multiple universities now where ethics is most often taught in a standalone class, often at the very end of your degree program. So when you're learning how to code and how to do machine learning and how to collect data, none of this stuff comes up. And then at the very end, it's like, okay, here are these things that are really important and you should have been thinking about all along. It was in one ear and out the other. It seems like a PR move at the end of a degree. I can also tell you they do this in law school too, separate legal ethics class. So then you're learning that ethics is an add-on. It's not actually an integral part of technical practice because you didn't learn it when you learned how to do the technical things. When you learn to write data scrapers, no one says you should read the terms of service. No one says maybe you should think about what this data is that you're collecting. No one says maybe you should try to understand the community before you're collecting it. No one says, hey, what are you going to do with this data? Maybe that should matter when you're making a decision about whether to write that Python code. Instead, you're just learning to write the Python code, which reinforces this idea that ethics is a specialization. It's something for someone who's not actually writing the code, which is the other hill that I will die on. Ethics can also be a specialization. I guess I'm a specialist. I think we're important. I think it would be awesome if, as people often suggest, that Facebook and Google and Microsoft should hire a bunch of ethicists. I think that's awesome, and more jobs for philosophers. But it shouldn't be just their job. It should be everyone's job. I never want to hear, I'm just an engineer, again. You should at least know the right questions to ask, and then maybe the right person to ask in turn. If I could change one thing through the work that I do, through my public scholarship, through the stupid amount of tweeting that I do, it's that if you work in technology and you do not think about ethics, you are bad at your job. Right now, that is not the dominant attitude. And right now, I'm just trying to start at least with the computer science research community, at least with the people who are collecting data to create these algorithms that can have serious consequences, can make big decisions, or eventually, the AI that's going to take over the world. I'd like to at least start with what kinds of things should we be thinking about when we're making these decisions. And I will end with noting that there is hope for these kinds of things. That question, that thing about how there's no norms in our research community and nobody knows what to do. The good news is that the National Science Foundation gave me and a bunch of other people a big pile of money to figure out what those norms should be. So this group up here, Pervade, We're all working on different aspects of that problem. And what I'm trying to figure out right now is how the work that we're doing in collecting this data is actually impacting the communities who are creating the data. Because data created by people is not just data, it's also people. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we have plenty of time for questions. Because we're recording, I'm going to ask that you wait for the microphone. Dr. Groman, the Associate Director of the Center, will bring the microphone around. So please just raise your hand if you have a question or a comment or want to hear more about something. Professor Fiesler.
Yeah, I saw earlier this week and I was wondering on your thoughts. I believe I heard that 23andMe were going to be releasing data, and that seemed kind of scary to me.
Yes, there's absolutely reason to be scared if you use the DNA. Uh, um, yeah, actually, those DNA programs like Ancestry.com and 23andMe take pretty broad rights in your genetic data, um, and they have already been used for things like criminal investigations, which has also been dramatized a lot on like Law and Order so far. You've at least seen that. But here's the big problem. Even if you are very protective of your privacy, which actually I'm a good example, so I would not do one of these things, right? But it doesn't matter because my dad did. So the thing is, it's practically useless to try to protect your genetic data at this point because so many people are doing these that it's going to be impossible. My collaborator Arvin Narayanan has been doing some work in this space, and he's basically suggested that this is going to be a type of privacy that's going to be so difficult to protect on your own, particularly as time goes on, that we have to have regulations in place to protect this. Things that will protect the privacy of people. You know, for example, not allowing these companies to give it to law enforcement or whatever.
That's kind of where I wanted to ask, but how could you ever implement those kind of pervasive regulation?
I mean, it's difficult, but you know, in terms of hope for the future of privacy, um, the new regulations in the EU are a good example. So the General Data Protection Regulations, the GDPR, is pretty new. If any of you think back to like March, April, May last year, and getting, you know, approximately 50 emails every day that informed you about the changing privacy policy and literally everything you use. That was because of GDPR. Um, and these regulations require more explicit consent for the way that your data is used. It requires the deletion of your data in certain ways if you request it, some things like that that were not necessarily common before this. That explicit consent thing is why all the privacy policies changed. And even though this applies only to EU citizens, you know, someone like Facebook has a few choices. They can tell EU citizens that they're no longer allowed to use Facebook, or they could detect, you know, what country someone is in when they use the site and change the way that they do privacy based on that. Or they just change all their policies, which is basically what everyone did because that's the easiest option. Now we're in pretty early days. It's been less than a year since it went into effect. So it's hard to say yet kind of how well this will work, but there have already been fines levied against some pretty big companies. I imagine we're going to see some interesting legal battles in the coming years about this. But one thing that I'm hoping might also happen is that we could start to change the norms around this, because something else is that a lot of people just aren't thinking much or don't really care about their privacy in these contexts. I think one of the things that's happening is basically learned helplessness. Like, why bother to care about my privacy? All these companies are just taking everything. There's no way to exist on the internet or on social media today without just just assuming everyone's taking everything all the time, which I don't think is a particularly good attitude to continue promoting. Yeah.
Thank you. So basically, based off all your research and your whole approach to, making, the whole ethical decisions on data and everything, how you think your research would tie into net neutrality as a whole?
I'm not sure I've thought about it in the context of net neutrality. Um, though I think that net neutrality is another good example of how people should have more control over these kinds of decisions. I mean, the great thing about what happened with net neutrality is that it's a really, really good example of effective collective action. We saw the same thing with a few years ago, some pretty unpopular copyright laws that were about to be passed. Um, and some big websites basically did a blackout. Like, hey, what would the world be like if there was no Wikipedia for a day? Let's find out. And so right now, there's been pretty good sort of action on this point. Someone earlier today when we were talking about this asked me, like, okay, so this problem with privacy, like, so what do we do about it? We don't have any control over these companies. And so regulations are one thing that can be really hard. But another thing is companies listen if the PR backlash is bad enough. Even Congress will listen if the PR backlash is bad enough, right? There was a big research ethics scandal with Facebook a few years ago, and in response, they created an ethics review board that looks kind of like an IRB, which is internal to Facebook. And that was just because of the media backlash, which I think is optimistic.
So my question is about the norms versus the regulations or the laws. And so with a lot of my friends, I see the same, like you said, assumed hopelessness about the collection of their data. And so to you, if the norm of a community is that we don't care or there's nothing we can do about it, do you still think there is, I guess, an ethical imperative to pass a regulation to protect that data?
Well, so that, I mean, it's an interesting question because I just kind of brought up the, learned helplessness thing, which suggests that, which is a concept from psychology where they did these really sad experiments on dogs and basically, like put them in a cage and then would like open the cage and then they'd try to come out and they close it again. And you do that enough and they stop trying to get out of the cage, right? So I know it's sad. And so at that point, there's a kind of manipulation happening. Like maybe people would care more about their privacy if it weren't being trampled on so much. So I kind of hate to suggest that because we've gotten to that way, we should, because that's almost a victory for for privacy invaders. Um, I've done some work recently on Facebook and how people respond to privacy controversies there in particular. And you see this kind of similar thing where some people are just like, well, if you don't, I don't have any sympathy for people who care about, because if you don't like their privacy practices, just don't use Facebook, right? Which is not actually a very useful solution because there are costs to not using Facebook. Serious opportunity costs. It's not just like, oh, I can't see pictures of my nieces and nephews anymore. You can miss networking prospects. Some organizations are mostly communicating via Facebook now. The president was like giving official addresses on Facebook. And there are some countries where the internet practically is Facebook. And so just, oh, everyone should not use Facebook. It's a kind of opportunity cost that also impacts people disproportionately. So people with more privilege might be able to bear that opportunity cost, but others can't. And so then you end up with, oh, well, you want to protect your privacy more, then you have to like give up all of these opportunities by, I mean, imagine trying not to use Google ever. Um, the other thing is, I I think that that at least researchers can be thinking about the potential norms and expectations of a community when making these decisions. So actually, a really good example is Yik Yak, which I said before. You know, we didn't collect data from them because of terms of service, but later I thought, you know, I actually think that was the right thing to do for other reasons because Yik Yak, the data is ephemeral. People expected it to not be there anymore. Like that was the whole point of Yik Yak was like my data was not sticking around. So it actually might have been not a great ethical decision to create um, a copy of that data, an archive of that data that their users expected not to be there. Um, that's how I would like people to be making decisions, like based on the actual norms of the community and not just on is it public or not. So you make a very good point, because what if their norms are we don't care about their privacy, but they've just been manipulated to feel that way? Oh, it's even worse. oh, come back there.
Well, a couple of things. One regarding trying to predict orientation, that it's less than 100% accurate, and a lot of people might be misidentified. For my adolescent and young adult life, I was publicly identified as L when it was actually A. See what I'm saying?
Hmm?
I mean, I have L friends on Facebook, but there are consequences of being misidentified one way or another. And the other thing regarding law enforcement, I think there's going to be a lot of racism and also classism in that regard. So I wanted to ask about those two things.
Yeah, actually, your first point is actually really important. That's the other thing about these predictive algorithms is they're never going to be 100% accurate, right? So you also have to think about the harms of false positives and false negatives. It's interesting. So in the case of the algorithm that predicts sexual orientation, it's harmful. It's harmful if it's not accurate, and it's harmful if it's accurate. If it's 100% accurate, it's still potentially harmful. Um, yeah, I mean, and the problems with the bias created in algorithms like this is that they can have serious consequences in perpetuating certain kinds of biases. Because then you're, you know, if it's some, I mean, predictive policing is a really good example. Um, again, garbage in, garbage out, and then it just gets worse. You're just creating more garbage. Yep.
Sorry, I have another question. But I was wondering what your thoughts are with your research interests and their intersection with the Fourth Amendment. And so, because you mentioned policing, but I was thinking about a community and its data, and perhaps an academic researcher is ethically able to access that data for medical reasons or whatever it may be. But does that still, in your opinion, extrapolate to the government or their right to come in for law enforcement purposes, for potentially good and potentially bad, either way purposes?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because government use is obviously another category of things. Like maybe we're more scared of the government than we are of insurance companies, for example. Um, I think that there have been some early sort of dipping your toes in tests of like social media and the Fourth Amendment. I'm not really sure where that's going to go. Um, though let me bring up something that's slightly related to this, which is that I do worry about the government and or other kinds of official uses of algorithms that are trained on something like Twitter data, because Twitter users is not representative of everyone, right? There are systematic reasons why someone might not use Twitter. And so if you're using Twitter data to, for example, make decisions about public health, like where to send the flu vaccines, then you're potentially creating a systematic problem there. I mean, even if you look at something like Android users versus iPhone users, there are demographic differences and location differences. And so if you're basing decisions on it's almost another kind of garbage data. It's data that is leaving people out systematically. And so if we're making policy decisions based on big data that is people who can afford smartphones, people who have internet access, people who have a good cell reception, I mean, whatever it is, then I think those kinds of uses of government data or government uses of data are what are really worrying me right now.
Thank you for the presentation. First of all, yeah, it was very unique and very informative. So, I'm just curious, probably worried too, that the future historian, if they wanted to write the history about this our time and how they will collect the data or primary sources, how they will go into it. I mean, is there any the reliable sources right now which we can?
I mean, arguably, a benefit of this huge amount of data that we're just putting out there about ourselves is that there is this historical record that there's never been before, right? I mean, this is why one of the reasons why tweets are being archived by the Library of Congress. I mean, this is probably not where you were going with this question, but an interesting kind of thing that's sort of related is all of this data about ourselves. Um, what happens to it after we die? I think about this sometimes. This is not my research area, but one of my colleagues does a lot of work in this space, and it intersects in really interesting ways with my work on data ethics. Because imagine some other ways that your data might be used. Say you open up your Yelp app and it's like, your dead grandma really likes this taco place. Or you can suck in all of someone's tweets, use these same kind of machine learning techniques to mimic someone's tweets. So same way with like, here's a bunch of pictures of professors. Tell me, like, give me a composite of a professor. Here's a bunch of people's tweets. Give me another tweet. There was an actual company whose tagline was, when your heart stops beating, you keep on tweeting. There's also a really good episode of Black Mirror about this. I use Black Mirror when I'm teaching a lot, actually towards this exact thing that I was bringing up at the end, which is, should we be thinking about potential negative consequences of the technology? that we create. There's been a move within the computer science community recently to think about this in very concrete ways, like when someone publishes a paper, should they have to write a paragraph about the negative consequences of this technology they're creating? And one of the things I hear a lot is, you can't expect us to see the future. How are we supposed to know how bad actors might use our technology? And so I use science fiction a lot when I'm teaching, because I figure, because students also get really excited about like talking about the ethical implications of Westworld or whatever, right? And I figure if someone can think critically about the technology that someone might create in 100 years, maybe they can also think critically about the thing that they might create tomorrow. It's also a good example to think about how really hard it is to regulate new technology. Lifelike robots is a good example of that. What are we going to do? And you think about, well, that's kind of crazy. Like, that's a long way away. But I can guarantee you that in the early days of the internet, the frenzy around how are we going to regulate this thing was pretty similar to if right now you gave me one of those Black Mirror robots.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Sort of going off of this, I really like the ethics is not just a specialization thing, and the idea that we need to teach technologists broadly that ethics is their responsibility too. How do the ethics specialists and the others who are part of the educational process for these students in computer science, engineering, etc., work together um, to give them that sense, right, that it is their responsibility, especially when a lot of the professors in the technical fields themselves have been educated in this way that they think that ethics maybe is just somebody else's job.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and also I'm happy to say something that other people are thinking about a lot more lately. As I was saying before, like I think one of the problems is the way that we're teaching ethics, not part as technical practice. So the sort of simple answer is, can we please teach ethics in the machine learning class, in the data scraping class, in the introduction to computer science class? But then there are some obvious barriers to this. And one is, well, the professors weren't trained this way. They don't know anything about ethics. How are they going to teach it? Or, machine learning is really hard. I have a lot to cover in this class. I can't take time to talk about this ethics thing. So I've seen a couple of very specific solutions to this that are rolling out in various places. One is for ethicists and philosophers to work directly with the people who are teaching the technical classes to figure out how to do it and to help teach it. I would like to imagine that there's even a model where it can be sort of more of like learning by participating in discussion and this kind of thing that could happen over time. Another thing that's very helpful is, especially to the I don't have time for it problem, is to figure out ways to integrate the ethical lessons into the actual assignments and technical content. There's a professor in computer science at Bucknell, Evan Peck, who has written some really good Medium posts about exercises for intro computer science classes that bring up inherent ethical issues. So one, for example, is basically the trolley problem, which is something that you can hard code pretty easily with some like if-then statements, right? So if you think about the trolley problem as a kind of like, well, something needs to make decisions and it goes this way or this way. Give me a bunch of conditions for it going this way or this way. Then you have to think about those hard-coded decisions, and you have to make the decision about whether, the pregnant lady over here is like, her life is more or less valuable than the kid over here or whatever. If you've ever played with the moral machine website from MIT, you'll find yourself making those kinds of decisions. Another one is creating data about a hiring algorithm. And the thing is that you're learning how to parse data by going through this big data set. And so you need to make decisions about like, okay, so it's an array of grades. You know, here are grades in computer science classes. Decide who should be cut off to be hired at this tech company. And so you write something that traverses the array and is like, only give me back the people who have this grade and this grade and this grade. And then after you're done writing this algorithm, it'll show you the ways that the data is messy. You know, oh, someone accidentally transposed two numbers. Oh, you know, what if someone had 500s and 150 because they had a personal tragedy that year or something? Different kinds of messiness to the data. I also have some colleagues, a colleague who's teaches data science classes, and the data set that he uses is actual data from the Milwaukee Police Department, working on, and so looking at the actual biases, just by having them do sort of normal data science stuff, but it's data that's biased. You're going to figure it out by thinking about it.
Please join me again in thanking Dr.